Welcome back to Shop Talk for Season 5. I'm Brandi.
And this is James, and we talk about all things related to mental health and cross-cultural workers.
So glad you're here.
Well, welcome back to Shop Talk. It's great to have Dr. Frauke Shaefer and Dr. Charlie Shaefer here with us to talk about theology of suffering and whatever comes up along the way. But I'll let you guys introduce yourself.
I'm Frauke Shaefer, originally from Germany. My last name is from my husband, more German than my original name. And so this is where the Lord called me to ministry, more specific to medical ministry. I became a family physician and as such went to Nepal in healthcare mission, ended up leading a leprosy rehabilitation hospital. And that increased also my interest in soul care, member care, along with observing that many of the colleagues around me suffered from somatic complaints. And already being interested in the talking cure, I went back to Germany to do a training in psychotherapy and reconnected with Charlie. We ended up deciding to get married, and I moved to the United States. And there, by the Lord's provision, Duke opened the doors so that I could do a psychiatry residency there. So I became a psychiatrist, and together we were very interested in the mental health and missions involvement, and started that pretty soon after. And initially worked with a few organizations, worked with individuals in our private practices, and then joined Barnabas International, with who we are now for more than 10 years, and did a lot of training and retreats. And in recent years, we have been more involved with healthcare worker support in collaboration with Alongside and also with MedSend.
So Frauke's covered most everything about who we are, which is great for me. I'm a psychologist. I went on the field first with SIL back in the 80s and as a computer center director, but then retrained in psychology and theology at Forest Seminary, and have been involved in one way or another with member care, counseling, missions, mental health since about 1990 or so, something like that. We have worked together in North Carolina where we've had private practices where Frauke is a psychiatrist, worked as a psychologist, but then doing work with missions and traveling and training. And then in 2013, we joined Barnabas International and have been with them since then. Mm-hmm. And still keeping our private practices open up until about a year ago.
Right. You guys co-edited the book, Trauma and Resilience, which has been a really useful resource in my library. So I'm very grateful for your contribution to our community. What initially convinced me to email you guys and ask to be on the podcast was I had one of our staff in one of our locations, our centers in Papua New Guinea, who runs our medical clinic there, which is both inward-facing, caring for the expats, and outward-facing, caring for the community. Ask about theology of suffering. She's like, we need to really address it because we're just encountering so much suffering. And obviously, both because of the book you guys put together, but also your session on moral injury, realized that it might be worth us talking about on a podcast so they could have something to kind of launch some of their discussions. She was looking for something practical and easily to get to just to help keep the conversation going. So that kind of is what initiated this particular conversation. So I'm wondering, when it comes to things like theology of suffering, where do you start?
I would probably start with that we most likely, even without reflecting about a theology of suffering, we have one, and not only in our heads, but in our hearts. And that's the one that we're often not aware of and that we're bumping against if we are finding ourselves in contexts of higher levels of suffering. And that suffering can occur to anybody in their home country, but it's much more likely to occur in more dense ways when we're working in less resourced countries, especially in healthcare, but also in non-healthcare professions.
Yeah, I think in our home countries, yes, we all at some point in our life experience suffering. We see somebody or know somebody that we know well, but then a lot of what we experience is maybe on the news or distant from us. And when you're working as a cross-cultural worker, I like the word that you use, that it's more dense. The experience is more dense.
Mhm.
It's right there in front of you. It is very difficult to ignore, whereas when you're not in that context, you can just turn off the TV or just, as we Americans do, distract yourselves very well. But when you're on the field, it's right there. And so, I mean, continue talking about it. Just,
It is right there, and it affects people you might have come to appreciate or even love. If it's your neighbors, or your local friends, it'll affect you more. Or if it's in your global worker team, those teams are often much closer knit, more like in a small village or in a little community, then it will naturally affect you more. Will hit home into your heart.
One of the aspects of that we've seen over the years is how much bigger of an issue and difficulty it is to think about suffering when you're a Christian who deeply loves and trusts in God, because it seems to, on the surface, to be a real conflict. You know, the ideas of the knowledge that we have of how much God loves us, how much God has promised to be with us, and God has promised to answer our prayers and listen to us, and yet there's suffering all around us that we can be praying about, earnestly seeking, sincerely hoping, praying for God, and trying to reconcile our understanding of a loving God with the experience of so much pain and trouble around us that is just deeply intrinsic to what a theology of suffering becomes.
Mm-hmm.
Oftentimes, we've found that global workers go on the field with less mature version of a theology of suffering because they may not have experienced it to the density that you're talking about, the frequency or the depth, the chronicity of it all around you, and that conversations like this one among people who have lived within those experience environments and sought for answers to what they are just profound and deep.
Yeah. So what seems to be causing the spiritual struggle is the discrepancy that people experience between prior assumptions and their experience. And that can be very subtle. For example, if there is an accident that has occurred while I was on the way to a ministry opportunity, then the question might arise, how come? Wasn't I on my best serving the Lord? And how come he seemingly was not caring or present, or was he absent? There are all these relational questions that occur in this discrepancy and leads to disorientation and pain.
Right. Why am I doing the right thing, the good thing?
Right.
Is it still not working out in the way that I thought it was?
Right. It's sort of, I think it's probably coming out from theological assumptions that have been, provided to the person, or interpretations maybe that the person has made out of certain Bible verses that might sound, if you put it kind of blunt, if I am faithful to the Lord, he needs to take care of my safety. If he doesn't, he's clearly letting me down. We would never ever say that.
Right.
But in our limbic systems, in our hearts or in our more subconscious assumption structures, we might actually keep that.
Especially when it comes to how important safety is as a function of our well-being. Our brains are hardwired to keep us safe in some ways that are automatic.
Right.
When we jump out of the way of a car coming, or we react even to shut down in our free state to try to protect us and keep us safe. So some of this is really built in to keep us safe. And then when we're not, that is quite formative.
Right.
And for us, it's instinctive for us to try to gain control of what's going on when we feel unsafe. And that means looking for answers to questions like this. If God's not answering my prayer, is it because I'm doing it wrong? Is it because God doesn't care? Is it because God is not really involved?
Right.
But we try to find answers. It's a constant process of trying to regain a sense of predictability to the world around us and heaven, and that pushes us into this kind of a discussion.
Yeah, we really want to grab onto something, like anything that's going to make it make sense.
Right.
Yes. We're so wired for meaning making.
Yeah.
And because it gives us more coherent understanding of our world, and it provides, how Charlie mentioned it, the sense of control, some sense of orientation.
Predictability for the world, right?
Yeah.
Where do you start with people and helping them to understand where they are, and maybe helping them to sort of expand their understanding of what suffering may be?
Can I step back one?
Yes,
Up
absolutely.
here? In general terms, I believe that our Lord is a Lord of suffering. He entered suffering out of love for us, and he has been present in the chaos of creation, and in the same way he is present in the chaos that is created after suffering, and in that struggle and in the attachment struggle that we're experiencing, the struggle to trust that we're experiencing after anything, suffering or trauma. And it's like it's a shattering of our understanding, but the shattering and the presence of God also provide the potential for it to come back in a recreation in a new way that might actually provide more resilience and more solidity than without it. So I'm saying that because I think that's my first reality. The reality is God is here. God is hovering over the chaos. He has a desire to enter in and bring the shattered pieces together. And then maybe I can, as a member care provider, step in after I have realized that.
And along those lines, Brandi, I think where I would look for it with somebody who's struggling like that is to help them surface what is the underlying longing that they really have, that they're wrestling with God over. And that type of security would be part of it. And then to be able to explore with them where real security lies, what are the actual truths that God has promised. As we look through what is in the Bible, the promises that God makes are ones about being with us and being inseparable. He won't let us be taken away from, but they're not promises about suffering not happening. The passages are really clear about that even in the midst of the suffering that we might be experiencing, there's joy to be found just in the awareness of the presence of God.
Yes.
But that doesn't mean necessarily that we won't suffer.
Right.
And in fact, quite the opposite. The Bible seems to make it really clear that we're going to be suffering in one form or another as Christians and as humans.
What do you think, particularly from people leaving Western contexts, where I would say at some point, hopefully, organizations or churches have had at least that conversation, or there's an acknowledgement of this reality of suffering going to, low-income countries, low and middle-income countries, that perhaps there's already, I would hope, some awareness that they're going to encounter suffering. What is the gap then? If that is at least, let's say, on some level understood, right? The Bible talks about suffering. Suffering is a part of it. Why is there still this gap that exists when people really encounter it?
I would say on some level, it's a gap of about 16 inches from my head down to my heart. We have a theological knowledge of things, a theology that we have about who God is, and it's not always felt at the heart level until we've experienced things and wrestled through it. And that's the heart, the spirit, and really struggling to see where it's, where are the truths in there that we can really hold on to.
Right.
That a lot of times we don't experience in our Western world, but I don't want to overstate that because there are many people who have gone through deep suffering, abuse, many other things here in the Western world as well. But a theology of looking at the breadth of a whole culture of suffering or poverty or disease is not necessarily what we would have, at least in our part of the Western world.
Right.
Right. So if you are about to go to the mission field or in the early stages of being on the mission field, or your member care provider who cares about those who are preparing or who are adjusting during their first term, it is good to encourage people to not just read a book about theology of suffering, but to personally engage it in some ways. Scott Schaef, who did the Theology of Suffering chapter in the Trauma and Resilience book, provides an appendix of some things you can interact with. But whatever it is, it can be any other materials, but it requires more this personal engagement to discover, okay, what am I really feeling when I am imagining a suffering or when I'm reading about a suffering? What are my assumptions? And to wrestle it through at a personal level, that's the best possible for preparation. It will probably not completely free you from the wrestling in the moment of impact. And I, back to your question, Brandi.
Yes.
I think one of the things that is really helpful, aside from holding on for dear life for the presence of God, to the presence of God and to the at least having heard about it and trying to believe it or trying to bring it in the moment, is if you're trying to assist somebody in after suffering, or you are finding yourself in this place, it's good to remember how Jesus felt about his suffering in a similar way, or how a psalmist felt in a similar way about his or her suffering, because it's sort of that connection point. Oh, Jesus, on the cross felt abandoned by God. And he expressed that, and he probably was much more than we might feel it, but he was in that moment, but still held. And to connect with the Lord in his suffering, in our specific emotion where we are, might be a helpful thing.
Maybe adding also your question about the difference between where we are in our theology of sufferings while we're in the Western world versus when we're serving in a more difficult circumstance. I think one of the problems that we face in the Western world versus one of the real gifts or benefits in those difficult areas where we might serve is that oftentimes in the Western world, we're dealing with theology of suffering by ourselves. Whereas when we're in an area of real chronic suffering or distress like that, we're usually in a community of people that are having the same experience and thinking about the same issues. And there's a freedom to be able to talk about it that we wouldn't necessarily have to speak about in a safer, simpler way in a Western world. And I think we learn so much in community with each other when our questions can be normalized and we have the freedom to talk on a much more personal, intimate, transparent level with each other and hear other people's answers to those same questions. We just grow as a body that way in community.
I like that you said that questions can be normalized. And especially when you're dealing with suffering, I think that can add such a depth to our relationship with the Lord. Whereas we tend to be afraid of questions. We tend to say, if we question, then we lack faith. But actually, the questions can really draw us into a deeper faith, even if our our understanding things don't quite make sense anymore. But there's the opportunity for much more depth there. And I wonder when you're working with people how you can help them to move into that space where the questions are okay. Maybe the fighting and the railing against God has its place, in our journey, especially when we're looking at suffering.
Yeah, I think our role as a therapist is not to prevent spiritual formation from happening, right? It's happening. People are being formed by their suffering and their understanding of themselves, of other people, and of God. So I think it's important that we're mindful of that and how to enter into those places. I think there's time where we may need to share our faith when people have really lost, like, what does it mean? Who am I? Who is God? To be able to come alongside and say, I want to share just a little bit of what I'm carrying in terms of our faith and our belief. But to do that in a way that's not, directing another person in their journey. We're not trying to solve their pain.
And like the friends of Job were just sitting with him initially, and we're doing well in that.
Yes.
And then we're starting to pass judgment and weren't doing well in that.
Yeah,
We should do one and avoid the other.
that's right.
And especially in the moment of acute suffering, and just hear and bear with. One thing that comes to mind when thinking about the power of community and suffering is the little snippet in Acts where Paul was just stoned and he was lying there and people thought he was dead. And then it says, and the believers from the nearby town, I forgot which one, they came and they stood around him, and Paul got up and walked into the city. That's the image, that just the power of presence for those who are acutely overcome by suffering, because they present in some ways the presence of God, even if you can't perceive of it, or their prayers bring in the presence of God, even if you can't do that at this juncture. Yeah. So that would be the emotional, just the holding just right after the impact. And then later on, there might be more conversation about assumptions and.
Yeah, so that journey in the theology that I mentioned before is a movement sort of from the head down into the heart and really believing and feeling it. I think one way that you can do that again is letting people know that their experience, the distress they have, is very normal and healthy. It's part of how God created us. And for some people, the Psalms of Lament can be a real access point, because those Psalms are filled with groaning and agony about the suffering that's going on around people. And God chose to fill his Bible with them. I mean, they're in there. He's giving us permission to come to him on that level of pain and distress, and yet in those Psalms still hold on to, by the end, sense that God is still somehow present with me, even though I've got all these feelings, and to try to wrestle with that together.
Charlie and I, we went through a trauma fairly early on in our marriage. And it was the story of Charlie having prepared for a church retreat for about 6 months. And it was already in the day before this retreat happened, he did not return from his long run. In fact, I found him in the Duke ER and with a head injury from which he fortunately quickly recovered. But rather than holding the retreat, he was in neurology intensive care. And I was probably more conscious throughout this time than he was in the early days. And so I had more of the trauma impact and realized that though the community did everything and they were surrounding us with everything they could, our church community, they were amazing and just taught us a lot in their love for us. But my heart was recoiling from God. I was not doing well with God. and sort of noticing it, but also not. It took a time until I identified what I was not wanting to tell God. And it was exactly the age-old question, why?
Mm.
You know, in my German mind said it did not make sense. It was not kingdom efficiency to knock Charlie out right before retreat. Apparently that wasn't God's idea.
Kingdom efficiency. I think you need to remember that.
But, you know, so at some point I came to the, you know, to the point to just dare to say this to the Lord. I think that's often sort of the thing to overcome, to dare to give the raw parts
To
of your
lament it.
heart,
Yeah.
to lament it, and to ask him, Lord, why? You know, this, I can't understand this. Can you help me here? And, you know, he did signal something to me in the quiet of that moment. But after that, it felt like, you know, the connection was more restored, and we could talk about more things than that. So I think to help people to come to that place to voice whatever is in there, even if it's very raw and might feel embarrassing, to help them to understand that God already knows, and that God feels very trusted if we spill this out before him, you know, kind of the worst of our guts. If we spill it out before him and hold it to yield it to him, so he can restore.
And James mentioned this, and you touched on it, Frauke, this loss of faith. And I think we're afraid of that. We're afraid of that for ourselves. We're afraid of that for others. It could actually be a step toward a deeper faith where, like you said, raw and honest about it, it can move to something much deeper, more beautiful in these times of trauma and crisis. And that's a scary thing.
It is. And I think as evangelical Christians, we tend to feel that we shouldn't be angry at God. And so that's a difficult emotion to actually put out there.
Absolutely.
But, you know, those who do will discover that God can bear with it.
We went through, I mean, honestly, we're still walking through it. Our youngest, our son was diagnosed with muscular dystrophy when he was 2 years old, and we were living in Tajikistan. And I mean, theology of suffering was just bam, right there.
Right.
I mean, I'd already been there living in that context cross-culturally. With, like you said, lack of resources and watching what the locals have had to deal with and continue to deal with. But man, so hard. And we were looking for answers like, oh, this must be a spiritual attack because we can't do our work. Oh, yeah, this makes sense. It's a spiritual attack. It's a spiritual attack because Satan doesn't want us to do our work here. And who knows, maybe it was. But I think the deeper answer is suffering's real and God is near. And that's like, there's been layers of living through that and working through that. It wasn't 1 month into it, we had it all figured out. And we were good with God's nearness. It's been a thing that we've like continued to wrestle with and come back to.
Right. And that's that we've drawn in our book from Sitzer, what's his name first name?
Jerry Sitzer.
From Jerry Sitzer, who wrote this book, A Grace Disguised. And actually in our book, he also writes and he points out, you know, there's one element of struggling with suffering, which is your emotions, you know, that and the lament. But there, you also need to actually think about it and make sense. And he points out what you seem to allude to, that suffering is real. Suffering is a part of a broken world, and it hits sometimes randomly. You know, a vehicle or a truck can run into your vehicle with knowledge of God, but randomly in some ways.
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't exclude that God is still watching over all of this, but it happens. It's real. And rather than to come to conclusions that are really bad for our souls and mental health, is that this is for sure God punishing me, or this is for sure God abandoning me, because both of these are both of these arguments are rebuffed in the Bible. Jesus with a man born blind. Who has sinned, this man or his parents? So he says, neither him nor his parents, but that the works of God should become obvious or manifest in him. So it was about the works after the suffering, not the cause of the suffering. And that's what we usually do to find meaning. We're going for the cause, and you might be slightly misdirected.
Yeah, there's three principles of well-being is that the world makes sense, justice is available, and I'm a person of value. And often trauma disrupts all of these. And back to your sense of regaining control, we're trying to find that meaning again in the midst of it. The world no longer makes sense. It seems like an accident that doesn't fit my experience where I was doing what I thought I was supposed to. How could this thing happen? And feels like there's no justice in it often. And then there's I think the shame component can come into our value. Like, if I am dearly loved by God, how could this thing happen? I must, either he's wrong or I'm wrong. We kind of toss out that dichotomy in a lot of ways. It doesn't leave room for both our experience and the reality.
Another path that seems to be a common struggle is people thinking, well, all things work together for
the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose.
Yes.
I want to throw that out the window.
Yeah, it's just a common approach people have, that in a way, as they try to find what is the good there, end up repressing the suffering and the trauma and pretending as if there isn't a suffering or a trauma in that sense, versus going deeper down into that and discovering what is the good that God could be doing, while at the same time continuing to hold on to, the suffering is tragic. There's tragedy, and God promises that he will continue to be working at the same time, and to be able to recognize and accept the complexity of more than one emotion at the same time, with deep sadness, grief, hurt, doubt, but on some level believing that God is present also, and God is working. God is, as we've talked about already, as we're talking about this subject, God is continuing to work to cause us to grow, to be more like his son. He's continuing to work to push us to have a deeper relationship and understanding of himself and how he works in this world, that we are not going to get separate from having some experiences like that. And I can say that, and at the same time think about the suffering going on in my family right now with my mother's stroke and the dementia that's come after that. I would gladly give that up if I had a choice to give up some of the theology that I'm gaining, because it's so grievous to be with somebody that's in that kind of a dementia. And yet there's a certain kind of emotional and mental growth that only happens when we're living in an environment that's filled with the gray areas, versus where we have to struggle to find an answer that's not quite so clear, that makes us go deeper into trying to understand the principles of God rather than proof texting verses, and to dig deeper and deeper. Parents see that, many of us see that, how a child can handle black and white, concrete, yes and no issues when they're a young child, but then in their adolescence and older, they have to start dealing with the abstracts and digging deeper. And I actually believe that God works in our faith in the same way, that when we're young Christians, things might tend to be more black and white with some of those issues, but that as he continues to work on us and in our growth, we face a lot more of these troubling gray areas, or as you mentioned earlier, the moral dilemmas that might end up being a moral injury when there's two really hard things you're choosing between, or even two really good things that you have to make choices between, that cause us to dig deeper, and God works on us in those times.
I appreciate what you mentioned about it's the proof text versus the lived experience, right? And It's like when we get to the point where we realize the gray areas where we recognize our lack of control and our lack of answers for things, the opportunity for more depth and beauty is so precious.
Right.
And getting to that point of letting go of that can be a little bit painful. You touched on moral injury, and I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit more.
So we have, with our colleague, Dr. Jim Ritchie, we've been looking a lot at the moral injuries that have been experienced by the global healthcare workers in particular, and come to see, of course, it's much broader than that across the mission field and the many types of workers that are going on. The moral injuries, as we've come to understand it, are the results, the painful results that can come for somebody who is faced with a very painful and important moral dilemma in which they might be forced to choose between two really hard choices. In healthcare work, one of those examples could be they're in a situation where there's a real low resources and or at least resources are too low to meet the needs that are demanding all around them. And a healthcare worker might have to make a triage choice between which person they'll put their efforts into trying to save. And they really want to be able to say both. They're there believing they ought to be able to do that, and yet they face that choice and the traumas of the consequences that come with it, and the distress that comes out of that. That would be one example. Frauke, what would you add?
Yeah, it's generally moral injury, the decision between two things that feel just not right. So you're doomed if you do, you're doomed if you don't. And they can lead to those morally injurious effects on our own hearts. So a common example on the mission field, especially in East Africa, is that people might be instructed by their organizations to, when they get into an accident, to drive off. So just imagine you are one of those caring, compassionate missionaries. You run into an accident, person is injured, and in that moment, your heart goes out, I should help that person, right? But you have it in your mind, you should not do that because you and your family could get, killed on the spot, or, there might be a mob. So if you're in this decision, in this moment and in such a situation, that is a possible cause for moral injury, because you might be pulled strongly into both different directions, because your organization and your organizational leadership has a lot of stakes for you, but you're also drawn in that same direction. And there are many other possibilities. Moral injury rich are people that serve in trafficking ministries in particular, where they need to go into situations that are kind of morally, ethically complex to be navigated. And in healthcare, fairly common. Yeah. So the results of it often are more in the domain of feeling shame and guilt about what happened and what I have decided in that moment. Yeah.
Would you classify moral injury as a form of trauma?
It's co-occurring with trauma often, and it's worsening like post-traumatic stress symptoms.
Sure.
But it's a distinct entity. It can also occur without necessarily being a trauma.
Right.
And but the key features of moral injury are shame and guilt, and of trauma is more a fear response.
Right.
And in that case, Frauke, as you're answering that, she's talking about the big T trauma that is what might be seen in the DSM-5 or something. In common social language, sure, people might say a moral injury is traumatic, but not on the diagnostic level that we would do that. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
And I think as you were talking about the common injury and moral injury of being shame or guilt, the healing process of that for us as counselors is often helping the person recognize that the moral dilemma they faced was not one that they controlled. It was part of the environment they were in and the situation they were experiencing, and there is no true shame for something that's not under their control or guilt about that. And the healthier response that we help, and that's most of the time, that's not always. Sometimes people are in a moral dilemma because of guilt or shame that they have. But therapeutically, when that's the case, the movement towards healing is back towards lament, to help them move away from the shame and guilt that is emotionally constipating. Actually, it blocks them up into a real process of being able to grieve the awfulness or the tragedy of the situation that brought about this choice that
Lack
they
of options.
faced. Right. And then with that, they can purely move forward with grieving or lamenting the situation, and their emotions can move forward again towards healing in that way.
I imagine there's some similarities in the lack of, the easy answers or the fit in our theology as we had developed it up to that point. When you think about the theology of suffering too, is that there's not going to be the pat answer that makes it all make sense.
Right. Not clear cut in any way. Yeah, and to go through such situations that are potentially morally injurious, is also good to try to find ways to do it together. Like before the COVID hit, the African hospitals in particular, they all had their practices kind of outlined, what they would do, what they wouldn't do. So it took the load of the decision off the individual.
Right.
People in organizations that deal with these potentially injurious situations, like especially in human trafficking, to make these preponderances. And what we do in those situations, it takes the weight off the individual. Or, with that accident situation, if it's a clear policy, though it can still be injurious in some ways, but it also takes some of the weight of the responsibility from the individual. So that's a real ministry that organizational leaders can provide to their people.
Yeah, we had a family recently that were medical staff, very remote, and it's that kind of, they're getting absolutely toasted, burned out, just so difficult, the context in which they're living and serving, and do we leave or not? And if we leave, we're leaving people behind in a big gap. And, there's already people dying with them there. And then when they leave, it's increasing even more. And, they needed an organization to come in and say, it's time for a break.
Yes. Right. And help them make that decision that is so hard to make when you feel the two different poles of the moral injury dilemma. Yeah.
Well, we've actually heard from the healthcare workers that we've worked with is that when given a choice between moral injury and burnout, they will choose burnout almost always.
Right. Because that is ultimately is on them.
They feel the pain of it, they shut down, but they're able to work as hard as they can, as long as they can, until they burn out, rather than make the moral decision to seek the resources they need and take it away from the time they're spending with their patients in order to recover and be able to stay in the long run.
And I think it just emphasizes the power of shame, and it's such a strong and such a painful emotion for all of us humans, and we try to avoid it for good reasons.
Yes, that's right. As much as possible.
And typically Christian global workers have a high level of conscience, so that's certainly also something that is a professional risk factor in this arena.
And right along with the shame is also in the healthcare workers that we were spending our time with, there's a deep, deep desire and commitment to care for people, which is just highly motivating. And their love for others can hold them from wanting to get away and take care of themselves in that time.
Yeah, and we see that not just in the medical staff,
Right.
but certainly in most cross-cultural workers, because
Mm-hmm.
it takes a lot to leave
Mhm.
one's home context and culture and family and friends and go
Mhm.
to
Right.
the othermost parts of the world. So
Right. You've invested so
right.
much. You kind of want to make it work.
right,
We see that in the pastors who are building churches and founding churches, and they give their whole lives to that ministry and availability at all sorts of hours.
right.
And it's hard to put balance to that.
I
It's
think
always it's always spiritually significant and
yeah,
eternally significant. And so we feel like we can't say no. And we can't draw boundaries.
Mhm.
So
Right.
perhaps at the cost of family
Mhm.
for those that are parents.
Right.
Well, as we kind of wrap up, do you have any good resources that we can point people to who are either in a caring position, looking more at how to help someone along this
Mhm.
formation and theology discovery, or for those who are living in the context saying, I need to revisit this?
Mhm. Maybe starting with a moral injury. If there are member care teams, they could contact either Jim at alongsidecares.net or Frauke, Frauke, at alongsidecares.net, and we would be able to provide them access to a moral injury training that is just, it is basically a video that one can use with interactive parts in one's team meetings and work on additional resources to that topic.
That sounds like a great resource for like a clinic or a hospital or
Or, yeah,
a team.
right.
Right.
A clinical, a counseling team or a member
Okay.
care team.
Sure.
Yeah.
Jim Ritchie has also published a pamphlet on moral injury that can be a good resource for reading about that and understanding.
Right. With regards to the theology of suffering, you mentioned our book,
I recommend it.
Trauma and Resilience, and then Scott Schaum's The Uninvited Companion comes out of his personal wrestling with a chronic condition, and is very theology based, so that's been helpful for many people. Then what we mentioned,
Jerry
Jerry
Sitzer,
Sitzer,
Grace Disguised.
yeah,
Great.
and the Grace Revealed as a follow-up. The Grace Revealed dealing more with sort of what has grown in the middle of the suffering, and to review that and see the beauty and the solidness of the post-suffering growth. And then Tim Keller, I can't exactly remember the topic, but
A Reason for God?
no, it's not the meaning of suffering, but it has suffering in the
Okay.
title.
I'll look it up and put it in the notes.
Right.
Yeah, he's the one who said if we knew everything God knows, we would ask for exactly what he gives. Not that that's the quote I'm going to in the midst of suffering. Guys, thank you so much for taking some time to come and to talk to us about theology of suffering and moral injury. I'm looking forward to sharing it with our teams on the ground that have been asking for it. So
it's been great talking
You're
to
so
you both.
welcome.
Really
Yes.
Thank you for making us part of it.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Really appreciate
And
it so much.
we learn too, as we're talking like this together about this, is so important. Thank you.
all right, thanks, Brandi.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Really good to meet you both. Thank you for this.
Nice to meet you as well, sometime face to face.
I would love that.
Maybe mental health and missions.
Maybe
right here.
Sure.
Yeah, that's true.
We'll be there in November.
We compared our dating stories.
Okay. I don't know if one can compare to James and Ellie's, but
Yeah, I'm here to say it is also a pretty epic story.
okay, James, I have your elbow. I mean, I probably can't get all of you in the picture, but I see your elbow.
Oh, that's okay. You know what I look like.
I do. James, did you see my message about your phone?
Overheating? No.
Yes. I was like, is that like my dog ate my homework kind of thing?
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay. Because James is like, I'll give you 30 minutes warning, and then I get this. You ready?